This section is quantifiers. This is the sign for all. Now practice the sign for all. This is the sign for a lot. Now practice the sign for a lot. This is the sign for another. Now practice the sign for another. This is the sign for any. Now practice the sign for any. This is the sign for each. Now practice the sign for each. This is the sign for more. Now practice the sign for more. This is the sign for not. Now practice the sign for not. This is the sign for none. Now practice the sign for none. This is the sign for same. Now practice the sign for same. This is the sign for some. Now practice the sign for some. This is the sign for two. Now practice the sign for two.
This section is descriptive words. This is the sign for all gone. Now practice the sign for all gone. This is the sign for bad. Now practice the sign for bad. This is the sign for better. Now practice the sign for better. This is the sign for big. Now practice the sign for big. This is the sign for black. Now practice the sign for black. This is the sign for blue. Now practice the sign for blue. This is the sign for broken. Now practice the sign for broken. This is the sign for brown. Now practice the sign for brown. This is the sign for careful. Now practice the sign for careful. This is the sign for clean. Now practice the sign for clean. This is the sign for cold. Now practice the sign for cold. This is the sign for cool. Now practice the sign for cool. This is the sign for cute. Now practice the sign for cute. This is the sign for dark. Now practice the sign for dark. This is the sign for dirty. Now practice the sign for dirty. This is the sign for empty. Now practice the sign for empty. This is the sign for fast. Now practice the sign for fast. This is the sign for fine. Now practice the sign for fine. This is the sign for first. Now practice the sign for first. This is the sign for full. Now practice the sign for full. This is the sign for good. Now practice the sign for good. This is the sign for happy. Now practice the sign for happy. This is the sign for hard. Now practice the sign for hard. This is the sign for heavy. Now practice the sign for heavy. This is the sign for hot. Now practice the sign for hot. This is the sign for hungry. Now practice the sign for hungry. This is the sign for hurt. Now practice the sign for hurt. This is the sign for last. Now practice the sign for last. This is the sign for long. Now practice the sign for long. This is the sign for mad. Now practice the sign for mad. This is the sign for new. Now practice the sign for new. This is the sign for nice. Now practice the sign for nice. This is the sign for noisy. Now practice the sign for noisy. This is the sign for old. Now practice the sign for old. This is the sign for poor. Now practice the sign for poor. This is the sign for pretty. Now practice the sign for pretty. This is the sign for quiet. Now practice the sign for quiet. This is the sign for red. Now practice the sign for red. This is the sign for sad. Now practice the sign for sad. This is the sign for scared. Now practice the sign for scared. This is the sign for sick. Now practice the sign for sick. This is the sign for slow. Now practice the sign for slow. This is the sign for soft. Now practice the sign for soft. This is the sign for sticky. Now practice the sign for sticky. This is the sign for stuck. Now practice the sign for stuck. This is the sign for thirsty. Now practice the sign for thirsty. This is the sign for tired. Now practice the sign for tired. This is the sign for wet. Now practice the sign for wet. This is the sign for white. Now practice the sign for white.
This section is connecting words. This is the sign for and. Now practice the sign for and. This is the sign for anyway. Now practice the sign for anyway. This is the sign for but. Now practice the sign for but. This is the sign for if. Now practice the sign for if. This is the sign for then. Now practice the sign for then. This is the sign for because. Now practice the sign for because. Thank you. I hope you had fun learning sign language.